It's Thursday, the 13th of October. This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative MP Bob Seely, Liberal Democrat MP Daisy Cooper, non-affiliated peer and director of the Academy of Ideas Claire Fox, and writer and environmentalist George Monbiot. Today, will Liz Truss have to U-turn on her tax-cutting plans? She faced anger from her MPs last night, but supporters say she must carry on.
Changing the leadership would be a disastrously bad idea, not just politically, but also economically.
Even the King had something to say when he met the Prime Minister yesterday.
Oh, it's a great pleasure.
Anyway.
Also today, the government says its growth plans won't harm the environment. Campaign groups disagree.
This is the biggest attack on nature that I've certainly come across in my lifetime, never mind my career.
And after more Russian attacks on Ukraine, the UK promises to send more rockets. But how far should British support go? We'll talk about Liz Truss and the government in a few minutes' time. We're going to start with this on today's programme. The front page of the Daily Mail has the headline, "Could Camilla have to swap her crown?" According to the Mail, the palace could scrap plans to crown the new Queen Consort with the crown that was worn actually by the Queen Mother. It also contains the controversial Koh-i-Noor diamond. It's a 105-carat diamond. It was acquired for Queen Victoria, and it's originated from India. Other countries lay claim to it too. The historian William Dalrymple says the issue of the diamond is a massive diplomatic grenade. Bob, starting with you, should the Queen Consort wear the crown?
Yes.
Why?
Because it's there, because it's history, because the Koh-i-Noor diamond is part of the crown. You may find it controversial, Joe. Some people may find it controversial. I don't. What
about you, Daisy?
Well, I worked in Commonwealth Affairs for 8 years, and it's very clear that the shadow of empire does cast, it's still very present and is a shadow over the modern Commonwealth and the monarchy. And I think it's right that the monarchy is very sensitive to that. But I think if we're talking about diplomatic relations, I think the much bigger threat are the comments from Suella Braverman, who's just set fire to our diplomatic relations with India.
Secretary.
Exactly, over the comments that she's made about Indian migrants who come to the UK and contribute to our economy.
We're going to talk about that in a moment, but should she wear the crown, the Queen Consort?
I think on balance, probably not, because of these sensitivities. I think it's important that the British monarchy and the modern Commonwealth do modernise, and they're sensitive to the fact that the modern Commonwealth has to continue to grow and become a defined organisation and shed its past from the empire.
All right, well, Bob says she should wear the crown, Daisy not. What about you, Claire?
I think she should wear the crown, or rather, I think that the debate around the crown is misplacing the diplomatic problems of today and rather narcissistically kind of dragging this diamond and history and in a kind of culture wars way into something which it's inappropriate to do. I mean, India might be upset about what Suella Braverman said. There might be all sorts of arguments. But I really can't stand the way that history gets treated as a political football in this way, and often based on our own contemporary sensitivities rather than anything historically.
Context, George, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, well, it's very easy to see why India's so upset about this, because it symbolises the extent to which our wealth was built on looting other people's nations. On one estimate, the British extracted $45 trillion in today's money from India during colonisation there. And so, while the diamond in itself isn't a big deal, it's not even apparently one of the biggest diamonds.
Well, then why shouldn't she wear it?
But it has enormous symbolic weight because it is a sign of that looting.
But it's also the case that it's disputed. I mean, Afghanistan are also laying claim to it, as is Iran and Pakistan. So it's not even a straightforward matter. And it's undoubtedly the case that imperialism and colonialism in the past did loot, as George has indicated. Michael, what seems a shame to me is that one thing that happened during the Queen's funeral was that as a country, people for once were able to look at history without apologising for every single thing that's ever happened historically. And people were able to see in the round British history, both good and bad, but there was a sense in which you didn't have to apologise. I mean, I anticipated people might start going around trying to decolonise the queue at one point, but it didn't happen. And there was a sense in which people could be proud of being British. And I do think that there's a danger that this becomes a toxic mess if it's politicised for all the wrong reasons. You're not going to solve the problems of colonialism in the past by narcissistically talking about what you're interested in today.
We've scarcely apologised for anything. In fact, it's only recently been that the...
King Charles has apologised for all sorts of things recently,
but
hasn't
it's
he?
only recently that critiques of empire, realistic view of what actually happened, have begun to come to the fore. And if now we're saying already, it's time to shut that down, move on, forget all about it, then what you're doing, and it's the very opposite of narcissism. What you're doing is shutting down the voices of people whose voices have been shut down for so long.
Let me pick up on what Daisy said, Bob, because Daisy referred to the Home Secretary and what she said, Suella Braverman, in an interview, talking about Indian workers, she said, who tend to overstay their welcome. In fact, they make up the largest number of visa overstayers in the UK. Was that diplomatic when India and the UK are in the midst of trade talks that have stalled?
So what are you finding fault with? The factual accuracy of what she said, or whether she should have said it at the time?
Well, either or both.
Well, if it's factually accurate, it's factually accurate. If Indian folks here do overstay, then that's a statement of fact. If it wasn't a statement of fact, then clearly it's a wrong thing to say. But I suspect very strongly it was a statement of fact. And I think one needs an honest conversation with people. Clearly, we need closer relationships with India. It's a massive country, fantastic country, extraordinary history. And we have very close relationships, generally positive, despite the sort of virtue signalling need to apologise endlessly for our history. And I agree with Claire, actually, history's in the past. You need to judge it by the standards of the past, not applying relentlessly today's sort of tedious virtue signalling on it.
Is that you, Daisy? Virtue signalling, and if it is factually accurate, it is true. I don't actually know if they tend to make up the biggest, as Suella Braverman calls them, overstayers in the UK, visa overstayers.
I don't know whether it's factually correct or not, but it's clear that at a time when the UK government are trying to strike a deal with India, clearly there are ways of talking about the positive elements of the relationship, and Suella Braverman has clearly tried to focus on what she sees as a negative element. And in terms of what we talk about in terms of apologising for things in the past, I think it's incredibly naive to try and ignore the fact that there are real elements of intergenerational justice, and the harms of the past are very real in many people's lives at the moment in terms of the injustice they feel, in terms of their economic opportunities. The Commonwealth is developing. The monarchy is modernising. The modern Commonwealth is modernising. We're going through a stage in this country, I think, where we are trying to reconcile ourselves with the past, and to ignore history, to recognise there are new parts of history, I think is incredibly naive and unhelpful.
Final word and we'll move on.
The people who seem to spend their lives apologising about the past are generally in this country. When I go to Africa or Asia, actually people are, they're proud of the fact they got independence, but they also recognise the benefits and the negative sides of the British Empire, and they see it as something. Look, if the British Empire was as evil, as you people say,
I'm not talking about apologies. We can be incredibly proud of many parts of our past. We can be incredibly proud to be British, but we can also recognise that whilst we're proud of many things we've achieved as a country, there are also some dark elements to our past as well. And there are two sides to the coin.
Don't talk over.
And there are two sides of the coin to this. I worked in Commonwealth affairs for 8 years, Bob. I have worked with people from across Commonwealth countries who see the positive bonds in the Commonwealth, whether it's a shared history, whether it's shared language, whether it's shared commitment to democracy and human rights. But you cannot say that that is the only bit of history that has come out of the Commonwealth. There is also another history as well.
Hang on. Just to clarify, and I'll get Claire to comment, and then we must move on. Are you saying there shouldn't be an apology for any part of history?
Look, I think you judge history. History has happened in the past, and we study it to learn to better our understanding of not only what happened in the past, but what we can say about our future and ourselves. And what I don't want is our age to be judged in 2 or 3 centuries' time by the values of that age, because they're going to be different.
I think most people want to talk about the future, and the British government are undermining our chances to build trade deals.
Briefly.
I don't think that you can talk about the future if you constantly distance yourself from the past. I think that, Daisy, you're right. We have two sides to the history. At the moment, the only side that's ever emphasised at the moment, all that anyone ever talks about is the dark days of the past. Yeah. And what that means is that you actually get a crass caricatured view. But it is interesting, isn't it? Because, well, it's interesting. It's interesting.
Maybe in your circles they do.
It's interesting that a lot of people will say, oh, now that we've got the economic crisis that we're in, nobody should ever talk about the culture wars anymore. That's irrelevant. Let's talk about it. Here we are, and it's one thing that I'm thinking about because I've got a big discussion I'm chairing at the weekend on it, but it's important to recognise that the culture wars won't go away because actually cultural warriors keep raising it. And I don't think this is I do not think the people of India are rising up and demanding that this is the key priority.
All right,
Suella Braverman being undiplomatic, I think, was a mistake. That's a different question.
All right, we're going to move on. We're going to talk about Liz Truss under some pressure following yesterday's Prime Minister's questions and then addressing MPs, her own MPs, in the evening. Let's talk to Vicky Young, the BBC's Deputy Political Editor. She's at Central Lobby. We have now some MPs briefing openly against the Prime Minister and directly to her face, it seems, at the meeting, the sort of weekly meeting that not she doesn't have, but actually that Tory MPs have. She addressed them last night. How serious is it, Vicky?
Well, look, things are incredibly volatile and there are various things fueling that. I think one of them is, to be honest, the quick turnover of leaders that you've had in recent times. It's creating factions, they're quite loose groupings, there are lots of rivalries, as you always get in politics, and that's making things, I think, very difficult for Liz Truss, along with some dire opinion polls. If you talk to MPs, as I've been doing for the last couple of days, there are dozens of them who think that they will lose their seats at the next election. That means that they are willing to speak out, willing to speak to the Prime Minister and criticise her to her face. The other question, of course, is, well, what are they actually going to do about all of this? There is no obvious alternative leader. You think when Theresa May was deposed, Boris Johnson was there waiting. People felt that they could bring him in and he would win them the election. That isn't the case here. So there's no clear plan, if you like. The closest I can sort of detect one is lots of MPs deciding they've got to try and force Liz Truss and her Chancellor to U-turn on some of those tax measures. One former minister said to me, it's like Gulliver in Lilliput. We've got to tie her down and stop her causing any more trouble. So I think at the moment there's no alternative leader or clear plan, but there's certainly not the case that Conservative MPs are happy and swinging behind her, although of course there will be some.
Right, I mean, soundings, you must have been talking to Conservative MPs. It's difficult to see exactly what happens now because the government says it's sticking very much to its tax-cutting plans, and there are calls from some Conservative MPs for her and Kwasi Kwarteng to reverse them. Any sign that might happen?
Not at the moment, but I think, as we keep saying, not at the moment, and things could change quite quickly. So I think what some MPs are trying to do is be quite specific about things. We heard a couple of them yesterday saying, look, let's look at corporation tax, for example. You know, maybe they do need to get money from somewhere. That is one way of doing it, is to raise it slightly over the next couple of years, and then afterwards you can promise to bring taxes down. I have to say there are still others talking about an alternative leader. One has suggested to me today that you could end up with sort of what sounded like the Tory equivalent of a national unity government, where Rishi Sunak could come in but keep alongside him those who supported Liz Truss, some who supported Boris Johnson, bring in a kind of lot of different talents from all wings of the party. Now, whether that is remotely workable, I think there's a big question mark over that. But as I say, I don't think anyone's pretending they've got any answers here. And in the meantime, that means that Liz Truss carries on, and it's up to her now whether she decides to listen to her critics or not.
Vicky Young there in Central Lobby, thank you very much. Well, you've been listening to that, Bob Seeley. You were at that meeting last night. What was your version and perspective of what actually happened? Because you've heard the briefings.
Look, hand on heart, I have to say my version of what happened there is somewhat different to what I've heard briefed up by almost every member of the media.
So tell us, what was it like?
It was a bit flat, but it was OK. I was there for the first 20 minutes. Look...
Did you hear Robert Halfon? Did you hear Robert Halfon?
I did.
I mean, he's a veteran Tory MP. He's been in Parliament an awfully long time. He represents Harlow. He accused Liz Truss of trashing workers' conservatism and everything the party has done over the last 10 years. I mean, that's not just a bit flat, is it? and the reports were she was quite shocked, as you would be. I mean, he's quite a quiet guy.
You know, the thing that actually I liked yesterday is that we didn't have any patsy questions. People are airing their concerns, and they're right to do so. And Liz is listening, and what we're going to end up with is a way of moving forward. I would just say to my colleagues that destabilising stuff now is I think we just have to take a reality check. One of my favourite poems was Rudyard Kipling's If, you know, when you can keep your head when all around you are losing theirs. Great poem of Empire, actually, talking about that. And I just think our colleagues have got to keep their heads a little bit, and we've got to think about what's going to happen in the medium and long term. We do not have an election coming up imminently. We just need to get back to delivering on our agenda. And Jo, if I can just point out, those are three things. Firstly, looking after people this winter in the energy support package. Really important. Politicians keeping their promises, so reversing the rise in corporate and national insurance tax. And thirdly, going for growth. And even the IMF, which has not been a friend for this government, says 4% growth over 2 years, the second of which you've got countries like Germany going into recession. Right. And with great respect, I ask my colleagues, that is a Conservative agenda that we need to unite around.
Do you think they are losing their heads? And you and others who support Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng are the ones who are being sensible?
I want to be a team player, and I think all of us need to remember we're team players. I did not support Liz at the beginning of the election campaign. I supported Penny, and I rolled in very strongly behind Penny. And Penny, you know, I wish Penny had made it through. She would have been a great Prime Minister.
All right.
But she didn't make it, and we now have an obligation to respect the results.
Let me talk to the others. I mean, Daisy, listening to what Bob Seeley is saying, I mean, do you think this is the time for a change in leadership 4 or 5 weeks into a premiership of Liz Truss and after a summer campaign, when we look at the economic backdrop?
I think the government needs to completely go back to the drawing board on the budget, and they need to fix this mess, and then we need to go to a general election. The fact is, a change of leader isn't going to make any difference now. You know, you think back to the time when many of us were calling on Boris Johnson to leave, and the Conservative Party said, well, it's the wrong time for him to go because there's nobody else that's as good to replace him. And it turns out they were right. There is nobody left in the Conservative Party who can do a good job, and therefore it's time that we go to the country, fix this mess first, then go to the country and elect a new government.
All right, well, let's look at the ideas for fixing the mess, as Daisy calls it. But one of them is to U-turn and reverse the tax cuts that were announced in that mini-budget. £45 billion worth of tax cut, 43 now, because they dropped and U-turned on the 45p tax rate policy. Should there be a delay to the cut in the basic rate of income tax to 2024?
Our borrowing ratios are very low compared to almost any other G7 country.
But the cost of borrowing... Now, hang on, Bob, because I've given you a lot of time to set out, and we need to put some of the other things that have been set out.
Then the answer is no.
Right, so the answer is no. Should there be a staggered increase in corporation tax?
I think the government needs to stick to its agenda and move on it. I'm not an economist sitting in the Treasury. But no, look, I trust Kwasi, I trust Liz. We need to stick to our agenda. We need to make sure our colleagues are on side. But I think it's really important that politicians keep their promises. And we promised not to raise corporation tax. We shouldn't be doing so.
Right, but even if the cost of government borrowing is soaring, inflation is still running at just over 9.9%. The Bank of England has increased interest rates. Yes, there are global pressures too, but even Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss have said they should have laid the ground better. James Cleverly has admitted that the market turmoil has come as a result, in part, of that mini-budget. So you still want to stick with the measures that have caused this turmoil. If you borrow to fund tax cuts and you can't say how they'll be paid for, then the markets have made a judgment. And Liz Truss said very clearly yesterday, we're not going to balance the books by cutting spending. So I ask you again, will you balance the books by reversing the tax cuts?
I don't think we should. And I think Kwasi on the 31st of October will lay out the plans of how that is going to be achieved. But everybody in the Conservative Party supports looking after folks this winter, keeping our promises.
You've said that.
And developing growth and going for growth in the economy.
George?
Well, the important thing to remember here is that none of the major policies which this government has put forward has a public mandate.
That's not true.
It is entirely true. In fact, some of them
majority,
just let me finish, Bob, please, because you've had an awful long time to put forward a very familiar party line. And some of them directly contradict what was in the Conservative Party manifesto. We've had this new Prime Minister foisted on us by a vote within the Conservative Party, to which the rest of us were not party, she has moved in with this tranche of extreme radical policies, most of them highly unpopular.
Which ones are you talking about?
All the way from her attempt to cut taxes for the very rich.
She's dropped that.
Well, she has now, but she's been forced to, partly because she had no mandate for it, to her desire to create investment zones, even in national parks, to rip down planning guidance, to tear up the entire body of law inherited from the EU, including 570 environmental laws with no prospect of their replacement. None of this has a mandate. None of this was in the manifesto. None of this has popular support. This cannot be called a democracy if we can allow a government to railroad through Parliament
at the
and
moment,
pass
George,
the public
to be fair,
a series of
they're
policies.
not managing to get very much through. Bob, just briefly on that, I mean, that is the other problem, actually. They're not going to get it through because so many Tory MPs disagree with so many of this.
We had an 80-seat majority for the government's agenda, of which this is very similar. Look, we have an
majority for this agenda.
It's not at all similar. This mini-budget has been a complete disaster for two reasons. One, there are huge promises that are unfunded tax cuts, and it takes money from those at the lowest end of the income spectrum and gives it to those at the top. This has to be fixed, and they need to go back to the drawing board. It's indefensible.
Bob?
Right, so do you support the income tax cut of 20 to 19 pence, yes or no?
Yes, the Liberal Democrats would not block that in Parliament, but it still doesn't address the problem that this mini-budget has 43...
So you believe in lower taxes?
43...
So you believe in lowering taxes for folks in this country,
£43 billion worth of unfunded tax cuts that have meant the markets have gone crazy, people's mortgages are going up, and you're taking money from the lowest end to the richest end.
We're putting money back in people's pockets.
You're not.
And
You've frozen. You've frozen
let me bring
income
in Claire, and then I'm going to come back
tax.
to this issue of whether or not there is a mandate for this.
On the mandate, in terms of the things that George indicated, I think that some of it, I mean, certainly the domestication of EU laws, there is very much a mandate for that, let's be honest. But you've got a real point about one of the things that people feel is that politics is broken. And one reason they feel it is because actually, despite everything, Boris Johnson was the person who was voted for, and he was kind of internally deposed, and then something else happened. And so there is the feeling, whether we like it or not, that people feel as though what's happening in Westminster has got nothing to do with them. But on the deeper problem, which is on the economy at the moment, one of the things that I find frustrating is that tax cuts, and the tax cuts that were announced, are not going to actually lead to the growth that we keep hearing about. So this is a real problem for me, which is, I agree that we need economic growth. I do not think that it is only the way that this was announced and the tax cuts being announced that has led to an economic crisis. I think that the lack of productivity in the economy that's been going on for decades has been a disaster. And the truth is, politicians on all sides have accepted that cheap money and have not looked at the problems of productivity and have often opposed a lot of the growth measures that would be necessary. So I appreciate when somebody says we need growth. It's just that this idea that by giving people more money in their pockets, particularly the capitalist class more money in the pockets, that means that they're suddenly all going to invest it productively, is a mistake and an error. Okay. And one of the dangers that we have now is that the way that there's actually been plenty of money floating around for the last decade or so. A lot of the corporates haven't invested it. They've financialised it. They're not interested in R&D, in skills, in investing.
Well, Claire's point is the policies of just
my problem is
it
won't go to where it's promising to go to. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. It's a disaster.
You make a series of very good points, and I'm just going to try to answer one or two of them because I know that other people want to come in. When it comes to the system, whether we like it or not, the current system is not presidential. Boris had a lot of personal vote. But if you look at the Conservative vote, especially in blue wall seats, it has been going up markedly over 3 elections. So it went up in red wall seats in 2015. Sorry, in red wall seats. It went up in 2015. It went up in 2017. It went up in 2019. 19 was associated with Boris, but that trend was going anyway.
It's associated with Brexit.
Well,
really.
it was associated
All right,
with
well, we're
Boris's...
not going to rehearse those.
No, but I'm
we're
just
not going to
pointing
rehearse
out.
these on.
So
I'm going
this
to
is a
pick up-
broader...
I
For Claire,
want-
I think this is a broader trend.
Fine, but I want to pick up on some of the things that George has been talking about, particularly the idea that Liz Truss does not have a mandate for some of the moves that she is making that you feel might destroy some of the environmental protections. And before I come back to you, we're going to just show you this headline, the BBC News story, which says direct action not ruled out by conservation groups over environment policies. It might come up in a few minutes. Let's talk to Claire Marshall, who is at Durham Park, which is owned by the National Trust. Hello to you, Claire. Tell us, first of all, what issues do these groups, these conservation groups, have with the government?
Well, they feel like nature is being attacked on all fronts. I was actually going to kind of do a bit of a creaky metaphor there, Joan, that the clouds on the horizon, it's sunny at the moment. They're holding back on actually calling for any direct action at the moment, these main groups. So you've got the RSPB, the National Trust and the Wildlife Trust. I met 3 of these heads just the day before yesterday, and they are coming together. They're absolutely furious in a coalition which is unprecedented against what they see as the government's attack on nature. So what are they so annoyed about? First of all, you've got the reversal of the moratorium on fracking. A rural group's going to be listened to anymore. You've then got the review of ELMS. These are the subsidies for farming. They were designed by Michael Gove, and they were designed to put environment at the heart of payments for farmers for what they do. This is being reviewed. There's no clarity at the moment about what's going to come next. And I've spoken to a lawyer who's actually drawing up contracts at the moment based on this system that put environment at the heart of farming. That's now being reviewed. You've then got investment zones. A lot of people are really worried about these. Local councils have had about 2 weeks to come up with a plan for what they're going to include. And I looked at one of the application forms this morning with regards to the environment, and it says in an investment zone, the plan is the removal of burdensome EU requirements that do not necessarily protect the environment. And then the last thing is a bill on the statute books at the moment, which is looking at actually removing any EU-derived laws that don't want to be fitted into our own legislation. So that's going to happen at the end of next year. And I've got a DEFRA official privately saying, how are we going to look at 570 pieces of legislation that look after the environment in that time and decide which ones we want? So they are absolutely furious.
Yes, and they're obviously united around the issues that you have just listed. Is it markedly different from what the government under Boris Johnson was doing?
I mean, they're all talking about a complete U-turn, another U-turn that you've been talking about this morning. Becky Spate from the RSPB said that she's the only one of the 3 to have met the Environment Secretary. The other 2 haven't been asked to meet him yet. So you've got the head of the National Trust, Hilary McGrady, who said to me that wasn't normal. Normally, the whole sector, the key heads of it, are invited to meet the Environment Secretary. They haven't been asked in, apart from Becky Spate, who said that they just didn't have a meeting of minds. So she called it a completely different tone. As I said, Michael Gove was the one behind the redesigning of farming subsidies, which may feel a bit dry, but actually it really governs everything we see around us. It's how farmers and landowners are paid to look after the environment. That's now up in the air. All along the time we are getting, and we talk to DEFRA kind of most days, saying, can we have clarity? What are you responding to about these criticisms? And every time we do get these reassurances, so this commitment to the environment, this commitment not to roll back on any of these protections. But what these groups are so upset about is the fact that they're not getting the specific reassurances.
Yes.
So, for example, on the EU laws, are they going to be rolled back or not?
All right, Claire Marshall, thank you very much there. I mean, it's quite an achievement, isn't it, Bob, to unite all of those groups together, and they're clearly extremely angry and extremely worried about what they see, based on what has come out of the government so far, rolling back on the commitments of previous administrations. Again, does Liz Truss need to come out and clarify exactly what she means?
I'm going to be quite sort of hard over on this. I'm a member of the National Trust, and I can say now that Hilary McGrady does not speak for me. And I think this is part of a growing trend of the people who run the National Trust to be very, very out of sync with the members. The idea that there's some attack on nature, sorry, I simply don't buy. When it comes to investment zones, they're basically going to be on brownfield sites, so we can deliver the homes that other people keep saying we desperately need, and which we do desperately need. When it comes to our natural record, our record on the environment, we've got one of the most ambitious environmental acts that's ever been through any parliament in the world, firstly. Secondly, we've committed to net zero, and we are a globally recognised leader in leading our way in green industry. And thirdly, the government has committed to 30% more nature protection over 30% of the landscape.
All right, well, so they've got
so
nothing.
actually, I think Hilary O'Grady needs to stop playing politics and start representing National Trust members, and I encourage National Trust members to go to the Restore Trust website so we can actually get decent leadership in the National Trust.
So you've just completely destroyed the argument you were making earlier, which is that we have a mandate for everything we're doing, because all of the policies
What
you
do you
listed,
think we're going to do?
all of
Hang
the
on.
policies
What we're
you
gonna do?
listed were put forward by the previous caretaker of the government, Boris Johnson's administration. They are being rescinded and rolled back
No, they're
by
not.
Liz Truss. And
No, they're
this is
nonsense.
Removing 570 environmental
It's
laws
scare
with
tactics.
absolutely
Scare
no
tactics.
timetable for replacing them, and indeed a very clear indications that many won't be replaced.
Scare tactics, absolute
Pulling down the new framework for farm subsidies, which was going to turn it away from just being payments for owning land to being payments for protecting the natural world and restoring the natural world, all that being ripped down. Ripping down the planning system, using these investment zones as a wedge to just rip open environmental protection
I'm sorry.
and the regulation of the
utter
rural environment.
Drivel.
What we're seeing here,
This is
what we're seeing here,
and utter
what we're seeing
extremist
here is,
rubbish.
is a straightforward demolition of the government's previous environmental commitments, and the point stands.
Right.
There is
Well,
no mandate
But
for this.
one of the things in discussing what we were going to talk about on this programme was that this bit would be a bit philosophical, and I think that the article that you wrote that we read for this, George, in the Guardian made it very clear, and I think it is true that there is an ideological difference here that you and I have been on the opposite sides of for a long time, which is that a lot of groups historically associated with the environment have actually thought that economic growth and GDP were a problem. And I have always argued that this would lead to eco-austerity and the privileging of nature over human well-being, not just well-being, I mean standard of living, the gains of modernity. And we've argued about this many a time. And I do think that in that sense, I would be on the side of GDP growing. I mean, goodness knows, people are suffering economically now. The idea that you do it with a green twint
at the expense of nature and conservation.
No, but what I'm talking about is that I do think that it is important from a point of view of priorities philosophically that actually if we're going to have economic growth that we are all telling, lots of us are saying is a good idea, there will be things that will disturb nature. You see, I disagree with Bob completely, because since I've been in the House of Lords a couple of years, I mean, it's like being a member of George Monbiot's fan club, because the government has been so environmentally sensitive. They're the ones who actually talked about things which I argued against, by the way. We've got to have a moratorium on fracking. We can't have development because we don't want to disrupt nature. What about the bats? I'm being glib, but you know what I mean. And I actually think that if you're going to have these supply side reforms that you're talking about, there will be damage done to the nature that they're talking about. And that's what we should
let
do.
Mm.
me bring Daisy. I'll come back to you, George.
So, first of all, on investment zones, the reality is the government hasn't really published very much information at all. So we're having to discuss it in a complete vacuum. But there are genuine concerns from what we have heard that the government may be looking to sort of rip up some protections for the environment. And the situation we have is that local councils that are incredibly cash-strapped are being given a tiny 2-week window to say whether or not they want to give an expression of interest to try and get some cash from the government, and there are real fears that the government might do a kind of take it or leave it kind of offer to get money into local councils, as opposed to trusting local communities and giving them the resources and the powers to determine how they want to grow themselves. On that question about growth and nature, the fact is that GDP can be good for the environment and GDP can be bad for the environment. GDP is just a metric, it's just a number. And the problem is that you can have green growth. If we create jobs for people to insulate our homes, to put solar panels on our roofs,
That's the only
to
growth
protect
you
our
accept,
rivers.
is it? Green growth.
No, it's not the only.
The reason I'm asking is because everything seems constrained by green. So I've been arguing for a long time, well before the war in Ukraine or recent events, that cheap, reliable sources of energy were being compromised by the net zero target.
Well, right
I
now,
actually think
cheap, reliable sources of energy are renewable energy. They are cheaper
we
and more
put
available than oil
all
and
of the
gas.
subsidies, all of the money has gone into renewables. What we've done is
And
we've
they are now
limited
cheaper, aren't they?
our slightly cheaper, but they're not reliable, and we need to have
And that's
much
true,
wider.
because this is-
I mean, God,
So-
we've got an
All right,
energy
well, let Jo-
crisis created partially by environmentalism as an ideology.
Oh, don't be ridiculous.
hell.
well, Georgia.
Absolutely not, because we haven't
This
taken it
is
seriously
just
enough.
Pure conspiracy fiction. So, even the
You don't
person,
want to deal with it.
even the
It's not a
person who
conspiracy theory.
formalised the notion of GDP, Simon Kuznets, warned that it should not be used as an index of well-being. And what we've seen in rich countries like the UK is that the link between GDP and generalised prosperity broke many years ago. We've seen income stagnation for the poor and the middle, and we've seen the gains for the very rich getting bigger and bigger and bigger as they've taken an ever greater slice of Liz Truss's fabled pie. And yet we're still fetishising this number, GDP. It's become like a Maoist production target, that we must maximise GDP regardless of its utility and regardless of any sense that we might extract from it of improving our well-being and general prosperity.
Except, George, I mean, Claire is right. It hasn't exactly been growing over the last 12 years, so I'm not sure that actually stands in recent history. But, Bob, let's take investment zones. It's true that we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but generous tax reliefs, deregulation, planning liberalisation. Southampton City Council is named as one of 38 areas in discussions with the government to come on. Would you support that?
Yeah, for sure. Can I ask, I think Claire actually makes some really sensible points, and I'd like to talk about some broader sensible points rather than...
But is GDP being used as...
Let me answer
over
that.
everything else?
George I know I've read George's writing over many years, and he doesn't think that economic growth is a good thing. You can fetishise economic growth. You can have, if people are unhappy, why have economic growth? But actually the reality about economic growth is that it enables a bigger share of the pie. So we can pay for, just make the point, we can pay for better public services. People can have more of their own cash. I'll give you an example of how we can get it right, because we do need to green the economy, we do need to go for net zero, but we can't do it impoverishing people's lives. On the Isle of Wight, Jacob Rees-Mogg is down there as we speak, Vestas produces a large percentage of the blades in the offshore wind turbines. They employ about 400 people on the island. If you go further up the River Medina, you come to Aluminium Boat Builders, Aluminium Shipbuilding Limited, great company, which is now making boats, vessels, to service the offshore wind farms using battery power.
Yeah,
both of them are creating dozens of jobs. Now, that is, I think we need economic growth anyway, but Claire, we do need to be increasingly mindful of the fact that we have to do it by being better for the environment. That's what I'm trying to do.
My only intervention on this point
please.
was to say, I just do not think that the framework through which you have industrial growth in the way that you're talking about should be hemmed in by environmentalism, because actually you're mentioning two industries. There should be hundreds and hundreds, not necessarily green. And in terms of energy, there is a hesitancy and a kind of, oh my God, fossil fuels demonised. And what I'm suggesting is you've got to fuel productive changes.
All right,
It's exactly the other way around. Our protection of the living planet is hemmed in by our fetishisation of growth. And if we do not have a habitable planet, we have no economy whatsoever. We have no lives whatsoever. Everything is lost. And today we had a headline showing that 69% of the wild vertebrate life forms on this planet have disappeared since 1970. We are facing total Earth systems collapse here, and there is nothing left at the end of that. It's like the road. And so the idea that, oh, well, growth is being hemmed in by the green agenda, it's the green agenda which is being hemmed in by growth, and if we do not respect our living planet, forget it. Everything else has gone.
No growth, no wealth.
Just briefly, because we're going to talk about Ukraine in just a moment.
No poverty like
but Daisy,
collapse.
there are double standards with politicians. I've actually taken a couple of Tory MPs through local planning permissions that they've objected to, while they stand on the national stage and say we should have, building as many houses as possible. And the Liberal Democrats are not so different.
That's not our position at all. The fact is we have said...
Locally you don't block things and nationally you say you should go ahead with them.
We have said consistently that what we have at the moment is a top-down, developer-led planning system. That's what the Conservatives have created. What the Liberal Democrats want is a bottom-up, community-led system. At the moment, developers can buy a piece of land, they can choose what houses they want to build, they can make as much money as they like from it, and the planning system only really comes in at the end of that. What I would like to see is a community-led planning system where local councils can have the resources to build a lot more social homes, where they have the powers.
In your constituency, and where would they be?
Well, we have brownfield sites, and our local Liberal Democrat-run council is building the social homes that we need in St Albans. We also want local councils to have the powers to force developers to sell their land if they're not actually building when we need to build on those houses. We also need a register and I think a licensing system for homes when people want to turn their homes into holiday lets, Airbnbs as well, because one of the problems in my constituency is we have an entire building full of flats, and the vast majority of them are Airbnb. And that might be good for tourism, but it sure as hell means that young people can't afford to stay there anymore.
Let's have a look at this headline in the Times. Britain answers President Zelensky's call for more rockets to defend cities. This is obviously an issue where the West is being asked to continue to provide military and financial support. But there are questions now about how long and how open-ended that can be. How long should it be?
Sad to say, as long as it takes, and this war may last another 6 months, may last another 2 years.
Right, and you think you can bring the public along all the way through this at this level of support?
I think we're going to have to try. I think that's a really important point, Jo, because what is quite clear, that we entered a new phase of the war about a month ago. I was out in Ukraine about 3 weeks ago, and it's quite clear that there was a new phase of the war. The Russians can no longer win. The Ukrainians are likely to win in time. However, there is an umbilical cord that links the Ukraine to the West, because the Ukrainians are economically dependent and militarily dependent on Western supplies. So that is what Putin is now trying to target, the political will in Kiev, in Ukraine, and political will in the West.
George?
Well, I'm reflexively anti-war, but what I see here is an act of imperial aggression, the supreme international crime, as the Nuremberg tribunal called it, by Russia invading Ukraine, and the rest of the world has a moral duty to try to help them to stop that invasion and to defend themselves. And I would love to see that happen through negotiated settlement, but the only negotiation that Russia is offering is Ukraine's surrender. So in the meantime, offering air defence to prevent particularly cities from being attacked by Russia's missiles, I believe, is appropriate. I don't like the arms trade, I don't like the war, but here is a country which is having its sovereignty stripped away by the invasion of a greater power.
And the UK and the West should stick with it and the public support it?
I think so, unfortunately. Okay. I don't see any choice.
Claire, on the programme back in March, you said the West bore some of the blame for the way it had dealt with Putin and suggested that perhaps NATO should have been disbanded after the end of the Cold War and replaced with something else. But how would that have dealt with a dictator and aggressor like him?
First of all, I was saying that I think that having nuance on looking at how we got here was an important point. I also had made it very clear that I was completely 100% behind Ukraine. I actually think that understanding history is important, and understanding mistakes that were made in the past was important.
Well, Bob's nodding, having said that history is in the past and we shouldn't have anything to do with it.
History,
you look at history
and
learn from it,
not to apologise for it. Not using history to make cheap points, as it goes. But anyway, my point on this is that Russia, we're going to agree on this question of Ukraine. My concern is this: I have noticed a growing war weariness, and a lot of people are saying, I disagree, and especially in an economic thing, what's it got to do with us? I think that the government have made a terrible error. I think all politicians, I think we've all got responsibility for this, which is to assert that it's right to support Ukraine, but not to explain why. And I think in this country of all places, we should be able to say sovereignty and self-determination and convince people those principles that the Ukrainian people are bravely fighting for. We have to win a battle of ideas on it.
We've only got a minute left on the programme. I want to show you this tweet. Let's go back to the beginning, as they say. Nicholas Watt, political editor at Newsnight, a former cabinet minister, tells me, brace for the mother of all U-turns on the mini-budget today. A friendly person in the know is advising us to steer clear of the media today to avoid the explosion. We wouldn't want to look silly by tomorrow. # wait and see. Bob?
Bob.
No words? Speechless?
We have got to swim together, otherwise we'll sink separately. So actually, what we need to do is stick together.
Right, and if they raise corporation next year, which is what we're hearing, will you support it?
Look, I'm going to support the government, but we should stick to our guns.
Oh.
We need to stick together, and we need to support the government.
All right, that's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of my guests. I'll be back tomorrow with Politics UK at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Bye bye.